All right. If you'd like to open up to Ruth chapter 4 this evening. Ruth chapter 4. The big idea that we've seen through the book of Ruth, kind of the thing that they're really wanting, the thing that they're reaching for and hoping for in the book of Ruth is the idea of home. Home being a place of security, a place of rest, you could say, a place where you have the things that you need and you feel safe. And we first saw that in Ruth chapter 1 and verse 9. In Ruth chapter 1 and verse 9, where Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, she said, "The Lord grant that you may find rest." And that's really what that idea of the word rest is. It's that home where you have what you need and feel secure. And then we saw it again in chapter 3 and verse 1. Chapter 3 and verse 1, where Naomi says that, "Shall I not seek security?" And that's that same word in the original language as rest, that security for you. And so this has been kind of the driving thing that they have looked for all the way through this book. And you think even when Naomi's family left to go to Moab, they had a home in Bethlehem, but it was a famine. It was a home without food. It was a home that was lacking something essential. And so that's why they went to Moab, was seeking that idea of security and rest. And so when she came back, she was empty. But today, as we conclude the book of Ruth in chapter 4, she finds that home and that redemption. Now, it starts in chapter 4 with kind of that roller coaster to redemption. And that's something we've looked at as we've gone through the book of Ruth is there's lots of these kind of roller coaster moments where, especially if you'd imagine you'd never read it before or didn't know anything about it, you kind of think you know where it's going, and then there's these, wait a minute, I didn't expect that moments. And that's at the end of chapter 3, Ruth had, in essence, proposed to Boaz, and he said, there's actually by the law of Moses, somebody who is legally obligated to this even before me. But he said, go back to your mother-in-law, and I'll take care of this today. I'll make sure that by the end of the day, one way or another, you know who's going to redeem this family's land and who's going to marry you. And so he goes to the town, and that's back then the men, they would meet at the gate of the city, and that's where they gathered during the day. That's where business was done. That's where legal matters were attended to. They were all there in the gate. And so he goes to the gate and he finds the man who is the closest relation to Naomi and her family, and he asks him to sit down. And then he finds 10 elders, and he needed many of those older, wiser people primarily to be a witness to what happened, to say this was a certified and legal transaction that many people could say we saw and can attest of whatever is going to take place today. And then he explains the situation, or at least he begins to explain the situation. Then he says that Naomi is back and that her land had been sold so they could go to Moab, and that it's time to redeem that, to buy it back. According to the law of Moses, God wanted the land to stay with the family that it was originally given to. And so with the death of her husband and her sons, the closest relative is supposed to fulfill that. And so he says, it's time to do that. And the guy says, that sounds great. I would love to extend my property line. I would love to have a little bit more space to farm or to keep cattle or whatever it is that he was going to do. But then Boaz finishes explaining the situation, and he says, on the day that you redeem the land, you also have to marry the widow Ruth. And you have to provide a child through her to carry on this name. Now, it's kind of an odd concept to us today, but this is what they did to carry on the name of the deceased. The brother or the closest relative would marry the widow, and suddenly he's not so interested. He says, well, I don't want to jeopardize my own inheritance. And I think probably what he means by that is he probably doesn't have any children of his own yet. And so this son by Ruth would be his first child, and his firstborn. And the phrase firstborn is of most importance to the Jews. His firstborn son would be through Ruth, and he's concerned that not only this family's inheritance, but also his inheritance is suddenly wrapped up in this one son. And so that's probably why he's concerned about his inheritance. And so he says, I don't think that I want to do that. And so he takes off his sandal and he hands it to Boaz. Now, the sandal thing was, in essence, this was sort of the way that they signed the contract. And remember, there's all these people standing around and they're watching this happen. It's kind of interesting because the sandal thing was originally supposed to be an insult. And you can see this if you go back to Deuteronomy in chapter 25. Deuteronomy in chapter 25, starting in verse 7, it describes here this concept of there's got to be a son, and so they marry the widow to bring the son. But in verse 7 of Deuteronomy 25, it says, if the man does not want to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to raise up a name to his brother in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. And then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. But if he stands firm and says, I do not want to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the presence of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, spit in his face, and answer and say, so it shall be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. And his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal removed. And so you can get a nice little plaque and put it outside your door, the house of him who had his sandal removed. But you can see that this was a great insult. God had built it into his plan that a child be provided to carry on this line. And when the brother or the close relative says no, there was this, she spits in his face, and this is a great insult. It seems like by the time of the book of Ruth, they've sort of taken some of the drama out of it, and it's more of a matter of just transaction. Or it could be that in this case, because they know who the next of kin is, they know that Boaz is there to step in, it's not considered as big of a deal. But either way, he takes his sandal off, and he hands it to Boaz. And it even explains this in verse 7. It says, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging to confirm anything. One man took off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was a confirmation in Israel. And so it comes to Boaz, and that's, if this had been a TV episode, and by this point you're rooting for Ruth and Boaz, and then the man says, I'll take the land, and that's where the TV episode would have stopped on that cliffhanger, and you're like, no, I have to wait a whole week to find out what happens, and then it comes back around finally, and you have this moment of clarity, and Boaz is accepted legally as the inheritor of the land and as the new husband of Ruth. And there are these many witnesses there. And then there's this blessing. It says in verse 11, the people who were at the gate and the elders, they all said, we are witnesses. The Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel. And may you prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this young woman. And so this is a great honor and blessing that they are giving to him, all the way back to Leah and Rachel, the women and their maidens who brought forth the entire nation of Israel. And then, of course, Bethlehem, these people are of the tribe of Judah, and that's why they emphasize Judah and Tamar here. Those are their their ancestors. And so we kind of have this restoration, and that's continuing in verse 13, and right away she conceives, and she bears a son, and it says in verse 14, the women of the town, these are the ones who, back in chapter 1, they were so excited that Naomi had come home, you remember, so pleased that she had returned, and she says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, or call me bitter, because I went out full, and I came home empty. And then it's first full circle back to these women. And they say, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a close relative. And may his name be famous in Israel. May he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, is better to you than 7 sons she has borne him. And so they're so pleased for her again. And you notice that they can see God's hand in all of this. They say, blessed be the Lord who provided this. They can see what God has provided through Boaz and how he's there now to take care of Naomi in her old age. And what they can see there in verse 15 is that Ruth, right, he says, better than 7 sons. You remember 7, that's sort of the number of completion or the full amount. And I'm sure that Naomi would have loved to have had 7 sons. But they say that Ruth is better because you think if you have 7 sons, those 7 sons didn't choose you. They were born to you. And that's a blessing. But Ruth, she gave up her own family. She gave up her old way of life. She gave up everything when she didn't have to be with Naomi. You remember her promise in chapter 1, to the death, even into the afterlife, she said. She would be with Naomi. And they said, what a blessing that you had someone who was not born to you, but chose you and stuck with you through all of this. And isn't it just fitting that that's just the person who has brought an heir back to your husband's line, who has kind of, again, come full circle to provide. God provided this blessing through her. And so Naomi becomes one of his primary caretakers. And then it's kind of interesting in verse 17. Have you ever noticed it says that the neighbor women gave him a name? Now, probably then, that means that this was their nickname for him, because the parents named their children. But the neighbor women had a name for him also, and it's the name that stuck. Or perhaps they did name him and the parents accepted that, but either way, it's the name that we know him by. And they said, there is a son born to Naomi, and they called his name Obed. And that is a distinctly fitting name for this situation and all that it represents. Because Obed, the name Obed means servant. And that's the Hebrew word Obed means servant. And you think about what they're saying here. Obed, he's done such a great service to his family, just even by being born. He is the hope of tomorrow, of carrying on a line that they thought was extinct, of continuing. And you think, a line that they thought was extinct, and who does it lead to? Because it's from Obed. He says it there in verse 17. He is the father of Jesse, who is the father of David. He gives the genealogy, and it starts with Perez, and it goes all the way down. And you notice in verse 20, there's a man named Nahshon, and he begets a man named Salmon, or often it's Salma. And you know who Salma's wife is? Salma's wife is Rahab, the woman from Jericho, one of the only people to survive Jericho, because she put that red cord outside of her window, because they all believed, it says the whole city is terrified of God. They all believed that God could do it, but she had the faith to actually reach out and do something about it. And so God saved her, and she converts and becomes one of the Israelites and marries one of the men and becomes the mother of Boaz. And, I think Boaz's story makes a lot more sense when you keep in mind that Rahab is his mother, because his mother is not an Israelite by birth. She's a convert. And so you can see how he can see Ruth, who's not an Israelite by birth, but is a convert, and see such value in what she's doing and have such affection for her because he was raised by this woman. And so Salmon begot Boaz, and Boaz begot Obed, and Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. And so the line that was almost extinct, imagine if it weren't for Ruth, there's no David. There's no David. Can you imagine the Bible without David? And David, being such a servant king himself, as a shepherd, as a son, as a king, he was a man who tried to serve and do what was best and right for his people. A man who made plenty of mistakes, but who tried to serve the people. And then, of course, we know that from David, if we keep following that genealogy, we eventually, in the book of Luke, get all the way down to Jesus the Christ himself. And what did Jesus say about himself? One of the core and central statements that Jesus makes about himself in Mark chapter 10 and verse 45, I did not come to be served. I came to serve. Mark chapter 10 and verse 45, not just to serve. And you think about Jesus on his knees, washing the disciples' feet, but not just to serve, but he says also in that verse, to be a ransom for many. And that Jesus gave his life in service of a humanity who really had wanted nothing to do with him because of how much that he loved them. And this is his legacy. And you think, David, how was David such a righteous and good person? Well, just look at who his grandparents and great-grandparents were. He had a legacy to follow after, people who were servants. This is the legacy that seems in some ways to have reached all the way down to Jesus Christ himself, and that just as Obed means servant, that's exactly what Jesus Christ came to be as our Redeemer. And that's, you think about 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 30, because that's the central theme of chapter 4. Chapter 4 is about Boaz being that kinsman redeemer, to redeem Ruth and Naomi, to serve Ruth and Naomi by redeeming them from their poverty, redeeming the land that had been sold, redeeming the child that would never otherwise be born. And in that sense, he is very much a type of who Christ came to be. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 30, we're told that it is of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God, and he is our righteousness, and he is our sanctification, and he is our redemption. Romans chapter 6 and verse 14. In Romans chapter 6 and verse 14, he says, for sin, I'm sorry, that's not the right place that I'm looking for here. Let's see. I hate when I write the wrong verse reference down. It's probably like one chapter away or something. But at any rate, I'm not sure exactly what I was looking for there. Let's try Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 7. Ephesians chapter 1 in verse 7. This one does apply. Okay. Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 7, it says, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, according to the riches of his grace. That it is that sacrifice that allows him to redeem us, just as Boaz redeemed them. And so he's really a type of Christ in that way. And this is an eternal redemption. You go back to Romans chapter 8 and verse 23. Romans chapter 8 and in verse 23, but it says not only that, but we also who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly awaiting for the adoption, the redemption of our bodies. And so we have sold our bodies into slavery. We have sold our eternity into Satan's hands. And the cost to buy us back was his blood. But with that, he has purchased back our salvation. He's even purchased back our very bodies. And that's why he says someday he's going to take this sinful and broken body that we have and redeem it fully, transform it into that final body that has no connection with the sin and the slavery and all that it had when we were here on this earth. And so Boaz, he urgently worked to redeem them. He said, this day I will have an answer for you. And that's Christ gave all that he had to urgently work to redeem us. And he extends his arms on that cross to say, what does Paul say? Today is the day of the salvation. The shame was ours, and the glory is his, and he wants to redeem us and to share that glory with us. And I'm so grateful that he did, so that just like Ruth and Naomi found home and rest and security, he offers that to us today too. A place in this life, the church, where we belong, where we have a role to play, and the family and the security that they so much longed for. We're not any different today. We long for those things too. This is where we find it, and these are the people that we will still have it with on into eternity forever and ever because of the redemption that Christ gave us. And if we can help you to seize that redemption, or to seize that redemption for yourself again, if there's anything we can do for you, we ask that you come forward now as we stand and as we sing.
348.